All right, looks like we're live. Today I'm going to do a 2025 AI year in review, but not the hype version. I'm going to walk through the year quarter by quarter and pull out what actually changed in the real world, what got better, what got cheaper, what got more reliable, and also sort of where we're stuck. We'll talk about the major labs, OpenAI, Anthropic, Google, and XAI, and we'll also talk about open source because a lot happened with open weights in 2025. Just a quick note on how I'm doing this review. I'm not necessarily ranking the models by vibes. I'm going to look at what changed, some real product behavior, what got deployed, and what new sort of failure mode showed up. If you're watching live, please feel free to save this, come back, and hopefully at the end we'll have a clear set of takeaways. Yeah. All right. So if you look back on 25, I think there's essentially sort of three big themes. First is reasoning, agents, and open weights. Reasoning was about the models being able to slow down and be sort of correct more often. Agents is sort of about models being able to take action with tool calls, browsing, operating system, and doing these workflows. And open weights is about sort of the ecosystem around these open models. On framing, probably say there's like three things, three lenses. One is capability. So what can the models do now that they couldn't do before? And a lot changed about model capability over the last 12 months. The second is around cost and speed. What got faster, cheaper, enough to actually put into products. And then probably an important piece is really control, like what safety, governance, reliability, can you trust it, can you deploy it? And, you know, sort of to summarize, I think my thesis sort of up front is that, you know, I think a lot of people shifted from using one model to shipping sort of a model family and a tool system, ecosystem or harness around that, because sort of real products need sort of choices. You need sort of something that's pretty fast for certain use cases, accurate in other use cases, much cheaper in certain use cases, on-prem, open weight, and a bunch of things around it. All right, let's sort of walk through the year, I guess. Maybe let's start with Q1 of 25. This is where I think we went from the stage of sort of bigger is better to something that's where there's more deliberation is better. A lot of people experience this with new thinking or reasoning models where you trade some latency for fewer mistakes. And the breakthrough wasn't necessarily, I think, about like we suddenly learned a new skill. The breakthrough was that the products started exposing how the model uses compute: fast mode when you need speed, thinking mode when you need correctness. I guess in practical terms, in Q1 is when sort of a bunch of people stopped trusting sort of first draft answers and they started expecting the model to clarify assumptions, break problems into steps, check its work, and sometimes say, I'm not sure, I'm going to check. The trade-off, though, is I think a little bit more real. More thinking usually means more cost and more waiting. So sort of at the start of the year, in Q1, we also pushed, I think, a lot of product design questions. When should the system sort of automatically think? When should it respond? And the best experiences started to feel more adaptive, sort of fast by default, deep when it really mattered. And then you saw sort of the labs sort of converge on this from different angles. Anthropic leaned into sort of this hybrid behavior. So it was sometimes fast, sometimes deep. On the OpenAI side, they pushed the idea of reasoning first models alongside fast general models, and like their model naming was a bit of a mess at the start of the year, to say the least. And then Google started to make the assistant experience feel more integrated, and so it isn't just AI talking, it's sort of helping you do things. Now, the other major focus, I think, or major driving force in Q1 was really around the open weight model. So we had DeepSeek L1, which created sort of this moment where teams had to look at price performance and say, oh, the open models are not just catching up, but they're forcing folks to compete on efficiency. And once efficiency was on the table. It sort of changed, I think, how all of the major labs did training, how they serve, how they priced, and how to build like great products. Here the nuance, I guess, is just that the open models didn't necessarily replace the frontier labs. They sort of reset a baseline. I think if a competent open model can do 70 to 85% of the work at a much lower cost, then the closed labs can't just sell the raw capability. They've got to sell reliability, integrations, governance, and the sort of the overall system. So Q1 is sort of where I think we saw this like early shape of the, I guess, suite strategy, where people wanted a fast assistant for daily tasks, a deep model for hard work, and sometimes a smaller model that they can run locally and do something interesting. And I think that just to sort of, I think, make that more real, from my perspective, like I spent a lot of time with one model, more specifically in 24, where I used it for email drafts, meeting notes, coding, and research. And then in 25, like, it started to move towards sort of different routing. So for like certain tasks, I'll have one model. So for summarization, I'll use a fast model. For some security sensitive tasks, I would go for something in a more controlled environment. Hard reasoning goes to a deep thinking model, and that routing mindset, I think, was just a huge part of what changed. So I think, like, to summarize, I think that to wrap that up, I think Q1 was sort of this accuracy becomes a product feature, not necessarily a benchmark, a feature, and the open weights made that shift sort of unavoidable. All right, let's move on to Q2. Q2 is when the labs really started to ship the family concept in public. You see these major releases sort of positioned as, here's the flagship, here's the small variants, and how you choose between them. So OpenAI is a good example of this. I think they shipped 4.1 or something in the API, plus like smaller models like Mini and Nano, where the message was more like pick the right tool for the job. And you saw the industry sort of normalizing really around the large context windows up to 1 million tokens in some regard. Google did something similar, where they had a portfolio approach with their Flash models and the Gemini 2 model, from what I remember. And Anthropic lineup continued to be this like Opus versus Sonnet style distinction, where you chose between the two different characteristics of those models, even though I don't necessarily know if there's the two. I guess there's actually Haiku 2, so there's sort of 3 different models there. I think long context isn't the same as useful context. So like when people heard that like 1 million tokens, great, I'll dump my whole company in there. But if the model can't identify what matters, maintain coherence, you sort of don't get that. You don't get the value from those large context windows. So as much as I think the model providers started to sell us on context, like I don't necessarily think we really used it, but it was a selling point during that period of time. So Q2, I think, was really where folks started to realize where like tooling was important. So instead of stuffing it into the prompt, folks started to build retrieval, tool grounding as a first class part of the system. And tools really were a huge theme, I think, that came out during that time. And you sort of required you to use these tools. We had sort of I don't know, it wouldn't necessarily be an explosion of MCPs, but people used MCPs a lot during that period of time, still do today, and sort of dumping tools into the context window, as I think I did in a previous video on a stream, went through that. So I think that like this period of time, I think what happened is that like it really felt like, oh, I can use this for coding and technical work. Not because they sort of became like the best, but because they sort of got better at this combination of sort of reading context, producing structured output, following instructions, and sort of like hammering through these different things. So you could get the you could get this like multi-chain step of events that would take place where it would just keep going back and forth with itself as it made tool calls. and this is sort of in that loop where like I think people started to use the model more like a collaborator, like drafting code, running tests, interpreting errors, proposing fixes, and during this time I think it felt like it sort of has become more routine. Obviously it depends on the industry you work in and whatever else, but like it felt more routine. Anthropic's storyline in this period sort of leaned into builders, and this was when I think Claude Code really started to take off, and they started to push more on extended thinking and provide those tools for these agent type behaviors that I think they captured that moment really well. And Google storyline was sort of less about chat and like AI becoming more of a layer in your tools. The multi-model assistants, they pushed on, but like I think they didn't really do much in that period of time. I think they were behind. Google was behind for a majority of the year. Meanwhile, sort of the open source kept just moving along, like the Quen family of models, the GLM family of models just kept getting better, and we kept seeing these sort of improvements or in like training tricks, architecture choices that can punch above the raw parameter counts that they're provided. And I think we moved from like just like they really started to work well. I think there's still more work for these open source models to do, but that felt like an interesting period of time. I think sort of like Q2 ended with folks sort of agreeing on like model families are sort of here to stay. Coding is sort of this major driver of adoption with Claude Code, and this whole tool use and retrieval improved, but like I think we're not necessarily optimal. And this is where it's sort of like I think the start of the summer, from July to September, agents were really everyone. I think it was like the buzzword of the summer. Like most people wanted to spend their time, I think, talking about agents and this real shift instead of sort of answering an AI question. Now that AI is expected to sort of complete a task, and I think that like change like subtly happened, and it was more about like let me define agent in plain terms, where it can perform this loop of perceiving, planning, acting, and checking on repeat. It might browse, call some APIs, write some code, run some tests, update a ticket, generate reports, or operate a UI. And that loop sort of sounds straightforward until you try and do it reliably. So I think a lot of people ran into these sort of challenges of reliability as they tried to watch this. And still today, I think there's some more challenges here. And if you've ever seen an agent sort of stuck in this loop, it's sort of you lose some confidence as you go through that process. And like if you ever seen like a model use computer use, Anthropic have a computer use model, if you watch it instead of like calling an API, the model can basically just interpret and use a machine to do that, which I thought was like super interesting. But they still sort of didn't solve that, like solve the coding task. But then if you give it something outside of that realm, there was still hasn't reached the bar that it could reach. On XDI still, like they leaned hard on the heavy models and did multi-step reasoning, and it's surprising how few people use their model for how good it is. They really have fast models that worked really, really well. Like Grok 2 and Grok 3, I think, came out during this time, and I think they did a great job. OpenAI also released their open weight model. I did some work on GPT OSS, and I thought it was like a really good step for them to release their model. I wish they would launch a smaller model that will run on a phone, and then also a much larger model. But I thought it was like a good step forward to acknowledging that there was like demand for these like home brew self-service type models. Yeah. And then we so like to go from this like agent summer Q3, we then just had like we sort of ended Q3 with like agents of this clear direction, and we had some of these open weight models, and then Q4 basically just moved towards like the model companies just shipping. I think just as like how I would articulate the last couple of months, where folks really started to move towards getting these models out. So we had GPT-5, GPT-5.1, GPT-5.2. We then had the Google slew of models. We had VO, which was just an incredible video model. We had the new Nano Banana models from Google, and Google really came from nowhere to get to see demand there. We also had OpenAI ship Sora, and ship more recently their new image model. And then on the Anthropic side, I think we went from 3.5 in July to now the new Sonnet and Opus models that recently shipped in November, was around November time. Those came out like there was just a bunch of work. I think that they shipped a lot during the last 6 months of the year, which I think was really interesting. Like, it was surprising that they got that much, that they really got that much done. I think for the like pattern, so that's sort of like the synopsis of the year, I think, was that like reasoning at the start, we had some they spent like the summer talking about tools, and then towards the end of the year it was like put it into 3 categories. The third category was really about the like shipping, was basically the last part of the year. And there's all this talk about like the model harness and other things that I think are just like is a trend here, where these harnesses beat the single models. Reasoning became like a much more user-facing feature for people. Tool use became became essentially a benchmark. The open weights became pretty serious. Multi-model became just so much better over the last 12 months. And I thought it was just like so interesting. I guess there's still some things and areas of work for, I think, the providers themselves. One is like sort of this last mile reliability. I feel like the models can sometimes now get you until about self-driving, where they can get you like on the highway, but there's still sort of like this like last 10%, which is around missing steps, subtle hallucinations, overconfidence. The second was, I think, just around long horizon. There was a lot of like, if you try and keep an agent on task for a period of time, it'll struggle with like 45 minutes of work and lose its state, forget goals, get stuck in the loop. I think there's this like whole security thing that I'm not that educated on to talk about, but just like there's this whole attack vector, permissions, isolation, sandboxing, audit logs, and some other things that just like feel like we're very nascent in that way. And then like similarly, evaluation lag, like I think folks demo but sometimes don't measure, and the benchmarks have become more of a commodity than anything else. I think where they're sort of taken for granted, and sometimes people are grading themselves on their own homework. Like, everyone knows what's in the evals, and now the evals are a prominent picture when someone launches a model. And I feel like there was like we're still really not in a good place, I don't think, on benchmarks. Like, the benchmark can say one thing and then you use the model and it's very different. I think like I just did one on the new Gemini Flash model and it was super fast, but like, can it code at the level of Opus? Like, no. Could they be used together in some way? Maybe. But like, they claim that it's like performs really well on the coding benchmark, but like ultimately, like think there's a lot of decisions to be made basically when you're choosing a model, and the benchmarks are sort of like social capital, it feels like, for the model providers right now. Yes. Other things, I guess, is just like the true token cost at scale. So like the cheaper models don't necessarily mean cheap systems if it's running like longer sessions or like producing more tokens. I think it was artificial intelligence have this like new score that's, I think, super useful for this, but it's still there's still more work here, I think, to make them better. I will reserve time, I think, next week to do a 26 predictions thing, but I just wanted to give a synopsis of sort of like, just holy hell have we, as this moved quickly, and compared to the start of the year to where we are today, these models are like way more capable, and I think that's been a fun thing to watch, to have the opportunity to spend some time playing around with these models, and seeing that change. Like if you compare the start of the year to now, and you think about just like how good Claude Code is, how good Codex is at tasks and staying on task and doing and performing a bunch of work that really just makes everyone's lives, I think, just so much better. It's pretty crazy to think about, and yeah, I'm super excited for hopefully we don't hit this curve, but like hopefully the curve is still more exponential, and we get more and more from this space basically over the next 12 to 24 months. All right, with that, I am going to keep this short, probably one of the shorter ones I've done, but